Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Carrasco and I will be your presenter for this informative brief. Before I continue, I'd like to thank Staff Sergeant Bermudez for being in attendance and the rest of you as well. So, this brief will be on interpersonal communication. Before we go any further, we're going to conduct a quick classification and risk assessment. Classification for this brief is unclassified and the overall risk assessment is low. Two things we want to look out for, those being spilling hazards and you're at home, so possibility of home invasion or burglary. For home invasion or burglary, response is going to be call 911, run, hide, fight. And for spilling hazards, make sure to keep a cap on your liquids and keep them away from your electronics. Don't have a cap on your liquid. Either keep it far enough away so that you won't spill it on your equipment and fry your system, or just keep it off the table completely. All right, continuing on, I'm going to go over a quick learning objective. Now, the learning objective. Soldiers will learn how to use interpersonal communication in a professional manner and implement lessons from this informative brief. First, we're going to start off by defining what exactly is interpersonal communication. After it's defined, we're going to go over two factors of interpersonal communication. Those being cycle of communication and active listening. Throughout the brief, we're also going to go over examples and the importance of these two factors of interpersonal communication. All right, defining interpersonal communication. What is it? In its most basic form, interpersonal communication is an exchange of ideas or messages between two or more individuals. Now, this is different from one-way messaging, right? One-way messaging being like, for example, you read something in like a newspaper, that's mass media, but it's one-way message. Or a radio. You receive the information, but there's no way to give feedback or have an exchange. That is a key factor to interpersonal communication, is the exchange. It requires a back and forth transaction. Now, moving on to the first factor of interpersonal communication, the cycle of communication. There are four parts to the cycle of communication. You have the sender, the message, the receiver, and feedback. Now, the sender. We're going to go over their role in this cycle. The sender's role is to take the idea or the information that they wish to convey, and they need to find a way to state it simply. State it simply and state it in a way that encourages feedback, encourages a response from the individual they're sending the message to. Second factor is the message. Now, the message can come in multiple forms. It doesn't have to be verbal only. It can be verbal, it can be written. Now, examples of verbal would be a one-on-one conversation or even a brief. And examples of written would be like an email. Now, when sending a message, the sender has to account for limitations of the mode of transmission, right, for the message. For example, you send the email. The person reading the email isn't going to be able to discern tone, facial expressions, posture, things like that. It's going to be lacking a lot of those human elements that we interpret in conversation, right? But when it's written, you have a chance to make sure that all the words are coming out very concisely and precisely, and you can review it. So that's a positive to writing a message such in a written format. But if you're looking at spoken, right, verbal, there's times maybe the conversation keep going. It might not be the most structured exchange of information. You might have people stuttering or you not being able to hear you correctly. This is a limitation of verbal communication, but the people who you're sending the message to can use things like your tone, your body language, your facial expressions to also discern extra information. For the third portion of the cycle of communication, we're going to look at the receiver. Now, It is a receiver's job to take the information and interpret it. All right. Now, here's the interesting part. Everyone has their own personal experiences in life. Correct? So, just because you may, as a sender, may have worded something in your message to me a specific way, because of their past experiences, because of the way that they just might think differently, they may not interpret what you say the way you meant. All right? And this is where we get to the fourth factor, or fourth portion of the cycle of communication. You have the feedback. Now, the feedback is very important. It can serve for criticism that the receiver can give back to the sender, a clarification, make sure all the details are squared away, or confirmation. Be like, yes, I have understood what you've said. All right. It closes the cycle in a nice one pretty bow. Now, from then, once feedback gets back to the sender, then the cycle will continue throughout until there's complete understanding, in which case the cycle will end. Now we have a good understanding of the cycle of communication, at least I hope you do. We're going on to the second portion, or second factor in interpersonal communication. That is active listening. Now, active listening is very important. It is defined as, or it occurs when the sound wave of a message reaches the receiver of the message, where it is then decoded. Right? Now, it says sound wave, but like I said, verbal, written. You can take this same concept, right, as, let's say, a verbal message is sent, someone isn't paying attention. They're not actively listening and they miss details, correct? Compare that to, let's say, example, we all received a letter from BLC, correct? In that letter is given all the information you could need or use with packing list, documents, flight times, locations, everything. But if you do not actively decode that message, that whole email, you may miss some important information. Let's say you get your flight booked, you get the location, but you didn't read close enough to check to make sure you had all your documents. Now that creates an issue when you arrive, as you then have to gather those, and if you can't get them in time, your termination from the course. So that is an example of the importance of active listening. Active listening is definitely different than just hearing a message, right? Hearing occurs when either the sound wave or the written message gets to the receiver of the message, but then they don't actively try and decode it, like I gave in the example with the letter. And active listening is important to the cycle of communication. If active listening doesn't occur, the cycle can take even longer, right? Going back to our original chart here, or diagram, if the receiver is not listening, actively listening to the message, and then you have the feedback, which could be in the form of a back brief or a check on learning, and they don't have all the details, then this cycle has to repeat 1, 2, 3 more times. This causes confusion. This bloats out the time of the brief or exchange, and it's just not productive. So that's why active listening is very important to the cycle of communication, and therefore interpersonal communication. Finally, go over a quick summary. Interpersonal communication consists of many factors. 2 we covered today: psycho-communication and active listening. The psycho-communication is used frequently in official capacity, such as in a briefing, but it can also be used in an unofficial capacity, just as in like a one-on-one conversation with a soldier, maybe talking about issues. It doesn't just have to apply to formal events. And finally, implementing active listening will have a positive effect on the cycle of communication and therefore interpersonal communication. I'd like to thank you all for attending my brief, and this this is my conclusion.